I just wanted to review Revelation 16. I think it's important for us to remember when we look at these visions that John is not seeing history, right? He is seeing visions. So we won't see like the first bowl in chapter 16, verse 2, ugly festering sores on people. We won't see that. John saw that in a vision. He's not seeing history. We're not going to see the sea turning to blood. He's telling us what he saw in a vision. Think of a vision kind of like a dream. We don't experience what we see in a dream, but we kind of go, oh, what did that mean? Well, that's really how to think about these visions. So I just wanted to, like I said, I don't remember the conversation exactly, but it just left me with the feeling that perhaps I had left you with the thought that we are going to see these things, and no, these are just visions that he is foretelling, and that he sees. And as I compare the trumpets and the bowls, that's why I have it right on this section. I see the trumpets as visual ways to present the false teachings that will come onto the earth, and I think that's what is being pictured here in the bowls as well. There are so many similarities, but the key thing is just it's not that we're going to see that. So any questions on that? I'll stop recording again so that you don't have to worry about so chapter 17, this is the 6th of the series of larger visions. So the first was the 7 letters. Then he saw there was an interlude of the throne room in heaven. Chapter 4, the throne room of heaven, focusing on God the Father as the creator. Chapter 5, the throne room of heaven with Christ the Redeemer, the Lamb of God who has the authority to open the seals. So that's kind of a bridge between the first series of 7s. That's the 7 letters. And then there's the 7 seals. And then the 7 trumpets, beginning in chapter 8. And then the 7 visions, which we just finished. That would be the vision of the dragon in chapter 12 and the 2 beasts in chapter 13. And then in chapter 14, there's the 144,000 safe in heaven, and different visions of the judgment day at the end of chapter 14. And then 15 leads into the 4th series, or the 5th series of 7s, which is the 7 bowls or 7 vials of the last plagues. And now the last 2 major visions aren't broken up into sections of 7 like the others, but Revelation 17 through 19 is really Christ and the Antichrist, Christ and doing battle with the Satan's allies. And then in chapter 20 through 22, Christ doing battle with Satan himself and being victorious. And most of that last vision is the joys that we'll have in heaven. So we're in the 6th of these major sections of visions, and it describes Babylon, the prostitute on the beast. So I'll read littler sections and then talk about them. So one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." few things there just to mention. Throughout this chapter, as I look at this prostitute, I see it as the apostate church. So the false the church that has been led astray, people who are outwardly part of the church, but they've lost the truth. And the idea of prostitution equaling idolatry in the Old Testament was very common. And so here he's picking up imagery of the Old Testament. And then the kings, the earthly rulers, unite with the apostate church. It's just interesting in history that whenever the church that has been led astray and earthly rulers combine, it is really bad news for faithful believers. So, for example, at the time of Constantine in 325 AD, he becomes the first Christian Roman emperor, and I'm sure Christians were going, yes, this is what we have been praying for. But that leads into the church-state system, that if you are part of the state, you're also part of the church. And there's this intermingling of church and state. The church begins to use the power of the state to enforce God's laws. The state begins to use the power of the church to try to influence people in a way that's beneficial for the earthly rulers. And so that church-state system that developed has often brought terrible persecution to the church, both physical persecution and spiritual problems. That is what Martin Luther was dealing with, in the Reformation time, is that whole idea of the church and the state were they couldn't even imagine that there wasn't this mixture, and it brought all kinds of problems. So I think that's what's pictured here. The great prostitute, we're going to see that she's going to sit on the beast that was described in Revelation 13. So there is this unity between the apostate church, the false teaching church that's in the world, and earthly rulers. I'll go on. And by the way, through this, don't be afraid to just jump in and ask questions, okay? Because I think this is a tougher section. I'll continue unless somebody just jumps in. I'm not looking at you. I'm not looking at your pictures. So if you want to ask a question, just jump on in. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. So a couple of things in this section, I highlighted the word wilderness. The only other reference to the wilderness, the other place in Revelation 12, it's translated desert, but it's the same Greek word. It's when, the church flees into the desert to be kept safe from Satan. And here, the Spirit carries, or the angel carries him in the spiritual state, probably not in the spirit capital, but more in the spirit, in the sense he was seeing this vision, this spiritual vision. He's carried away into the wilderness, just like the true church is out in the wilderness. So the false church tries to mimic what the church does. And the beast, it's the same description as the first beast of Revelation 13. That first beast, again, this is a great example. We're not going to see a beast like this, but what we do see is what that beast symbolizes, how civil governments sometimes use their power to oppress Christians. This combination of church and state, and perhaps we're seeing some of that with right now. There's this really frightening. I don't remember the name of the law that has been promoted, but if it were passed as it stands right now, pastors could be in real trouble, because if we preach what the Bible says about gender and sexuality, we could be accused of being prejudice and I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but this is a great example of the government can is somebody going to bail me out and give me the right word? What am I looking for?
Versus.
Yeah, it's I think it was the Equality Act or something like that.
Government.
HR 5, Equality Act.
Yeah, Equality Act. Thank you so much.
It's not racist. It's, what is it, transphobic?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes. So
I think it says something also about you can't even do counseling.
yeah,
there are
it's a pretty scary thing. If it were approved, I don't think it's going to get approved the way it is, but right now, the way it's written, it would cause all kinds of problems for God's church. But that's just a good example of the government can use its power to persecute or hinder the gospel proclamation. And that's really what this beast is. It's just picturing how the devil uses governmental powers to attack the truth. And then it was interesting, one of the commentaries that I read, the gold, there's gold and silver and precious stones, that wealth of the church is not a sign of faithfulness. It is amazing if you have ever traveled to Europe and seen some of these cathedrals and the incredible wealth that is present in these cathedrals, as the whole building is a piece of a work of art, and yet it is really empty. There's nobody that worships there anymore, other than there may be a handful, but here's this huge cathedral and it's basically empty. So wealth isn't a sign of God's faithfulness. Don't be, if good things are happening in a church, that don't be influenced by that. Faithfulness is based on, are we teaching God's word correctly, right? And then that verse 6, that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, drunk with the blood of the saints. Over and over again in the history of the world, it's the apostate church that is very often the worst persecutor of God's people. It was, in the early Christian times, it was the Jews, the people who claimed they were Jews, but they didn't believe in the Messiah, who caused the most persecution. In the Old Testament, it was the church leaders who persecuted the prophets who were trying to teach the truth. And you see that over and over again through the course of history, that persecution very often comes from the church, and especially when the church uses its relationship with the state to try to force people to believe what they think is right. So I'm going to go on then, middle of verse 6.
Can you comment on verse 5? The forehead with a mystery.
What Scott? What's the question that you've got?
I don't know. It's like
All right.
it's just like the name written on her forehead was a mystery, and then it's Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Like, okay,
Okay. So
yeah, what am I supposed to read out of that?
So remember, Babylon in the Old Testament was the last great enemy of God's people. You know, Babylon was the one that took the nation into exile. So Babylon the Great, using an Old Testament term for this horrible enemy of God's church that almost wiped out God's church in the Old Testament. So certainly that's why he's using Babylon. And then mother of prostitutes, the idea that idolatry and false teaching is spiritual prostitution. And there's nothing more abominable than leading people away from the certainty of Christ. You know, this is one of my frustrations when I talk to people about the end of the world. And so people are terrified of the end of the world because they have been misled. It is an abomination. People who have gone to church their whole life but have never really clearly heard that Christ died for them and that their sins are paid for. They're still laboring under the idea that somehow I have to make it right. You know, that's the ultimate spiritual prostitution. They prostituted themselves to the devil's work righteous religion. So does that help, Scott? Or maybe a follow-up question?
Yep.
Right.
Makes it smile.
All right. And written on her forehead, remember, that's imagery that's used over and over again in Revelation, that God puts his seal on our forehead. That whole idea that, she's stamped, God knows who she is, right? God knows his enemy. Good question. Yeah, so I'm going to continue then right in the middle of verse 16, verse 6, where it says, when I saw her. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. Remember, there was something similar to that in the first description of the beast in Revelation 13, where it had a wound, a fatal wound on one of its heads that had been healed. And it was interesting, commentary that I read, are there echoes of the description of God here? God is described as him who is and who was and who is to come. The whole idea of the eternity of God, right? Is, in this vision, does he see these anti-truth, anti-Christian sounds like, that they're not Christian, they're not people who claim the name Christian. I believe that here he's talking about people who claim that they are Christian, but use false teaching and governmental powers to lead people away from the truth. And is it possible that this beast that once was, now is not, and yet will come, is trying to mimic that whole idea of the God who is and who was and who is to come? That the devil is always just trying to imitate God and become like God, and always fails. Going on, so the beast, verse 8, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, remember, there's that term, inhabitants of the earth, that's always a reference to unbelievers. And that just by looking at all the different places where that term inhabitants of the earth comes up in Revelation. There's about 9 of them. So the unbelievers whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world. There's that reference to election again, right? That God has written our names in his book of life from before the creation of the world. What a marvelous comfort that is. But these who don't believe, these who are impressed by the false prophets, impressed by the power of the governments, don't have their name written in the book of life. That they aren't God's own. So they will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for wisdom, a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. And the 7 hills is certainly a reference to Rome. Rome already back then was known as the city built on 7 hills. So certainly, the Apostle John is in exile on the island of Patmos because of persecution from Rome. So Rome, the government of Rome has been actively persecuting the church now. Under Nero in the 60s, Peter and John and Paul were put together, and now under Diocletian in the 90s, there is severe persecution of the church. So that this is this beast, that this governmental power that the devil is using to attack God's church. And then the 7, verse 10, they are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was, now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 5 kings plus the one who is and the one who is yet to come. So 5 plus 1 plus 1. It's difficult to connect with specific Roman emperors. Probably best just to take this symbolically, trying to mimic the divine number of 7. It could be that the 5 that he is talking about are the 5 great empires that threatened the church in the Old Testament up to the New Testament times. There was the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and now the Romans. No, I missed one. Anyway, because there's 5, and then the Roman Empire would be the one that is. But it's possible. You always kind of scratch your head and go, well, that's possible, but there's nothing in the text that would really make that clear. So I think maybe just here's a place where I'll just humbly say I'm not really sure what these 7 kings are, other than the fact that there have been great powerful rulers in the past. They've gone away. There's a powerful ruler now. There's going to be more powerful rulers. There's always going to be somebody who's threatening the church. Then verse 12, the 10 horns on this beast you saw are 10 kings, and 10 is the number of completeness, who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. Again, 10, probably just the idea of I should always close my emails because one just popped up and going, whew. That probably just the idea of, there's always going to be these kings who are present. I'm going to close the email so I don't get discouraged or just discombobulated. So anyway, so just this idea that there are going to be more of these kings, more people, powerful people who use their authority to persecute God's church. Verse 13, they have one purpose, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. And that one purpose is they will wage war against the Lamb. But notice, who will win? But the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers, the ones that he has called, he's chosen, the people who believe in him. So think about, John is speaking to a persecuted church. He's in exile. They have seen people who have lost their lives for the sake of Christ. In chapter 20, he'll talk about those who have been beheaded for the sake of Christ. There is incredible power that's being used against God's church, but the Lamb is victorious, and we are victorious with him. And then verse 15, then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So verse 16, first of all, that often in history, when the church exerts power over governments, there is a tremendous backlash against the church. Especially in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church exerted incredible power. It was a kingmaker. There was a Holy Roman Emperor called Henry IV, I believe, who actually stood as a supplicant outside the Pope's palace, trying to convince the Pope not to excommunicate him, basically. Incredible power. But guess what? Once that king became strong enough, then he attacked the Pope and used his military might against the papal armies. There were actually papal armies back then. So it's just interesting. So very often the governmental powers, secular powers, and the church will work together because they think they have got a common goal, which the false teaching church and the unchristian world, the devil is using it to lead people astray. But it is not an alliance that's based on love. As soon as one of them can attack the other, they do. And it's just interesting in verse 17, God has put it into their hearts. Remember that God's still in control. Think about it, how he hardened the hearts of Pharaoh, because that was his plan. God's still in control, even though things seem to be spinning out of control. And then finally, verse 18, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Is it perhaps a foreshadowing that the apostate church would be found, especially in Rome? Because in the earlier part of this chapter, the beast with the 7 heads that's seven hills. Oh, so the beast is the secular power that the devil uses against God's people, the state power that the devil uses against God's people. So the beast seems to be Rome, at least at this time. And then now he says the woman who rides the beast, who is really the false teachers in the world, is also this great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So is this perhaps foreshadowing that ultimately one of the greatest false teachings that came about was all the false teachings that's present in the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm going to pause here and just ask for some. All right. So let's just read all the way through. Does anybody remember who started?
I have, this is Shar.
Oh, good. All right.
I can never tell if I'm on mute or if I'm,
All right.
so
So
I have 18, so
all right, 18, 1 through 3.
18, 1 to 3. Thank you.
All right, go for it, Shar. Thank you. Are you reading?
No, my battery went low, so I had to plug in.
Okay.
So now I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay, after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice, he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons and a haunt for evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk and the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries."
Okay. And then this call to come out of her, flee the apostate church, verses 4 to 8.
Ready?
Yep.
Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn.' Therefore in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her."
Maybe I'll just jump in here. And this kind of reminds me of what they call imprecatory psalms. Psalms where the psalmist is calling down God's judgment on the nations around. We may kind of be a little bit squeamish about this, but remember, this is the voice of the persecuted church, and who has experienced horrible things at the hand of false teachers and governmental powers, and the persecution, and the people they loved have been put to death. And so, again, just remember, the destruction of God's enemies is victory for God's people. So when he says, "I'll pour a double portion from her own cup," you can just imagine the persecuted church going, "Yes, finally she's getting what she deserves." It seemed like she was, the world is getting away with something, and where's God? There is going to come a time when God steps in, and we're going to see that his enemies will get what they deserve. Let's go on to the next section then, verses 9 and 10. I think that's Tim.
When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxuries see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, "Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come."
And again, remember, Babylon was the last great enemy of God's people in the Old Testament. And this is exactly the kind of terminology that Isaiah, when he's foretelling the destruction of Babylon, talks in this kind of terminology too. the destruction of God's enemies is victory for God's people. So Tim just read the kings mourn, and now in this next section, I think Diane, you're reading this next section, that the merchants mourn.
The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin.
And then
Every
it's interesting that if you're a student of history, things like this have happened where great trading empires are suddenly gone, seemingly overnight. So the sea captains, I'm not sure who's got that one.
Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all you who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour, she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you.
So verse 20 is really the only words to God's church. See, when God's enemies are defeated, we can celebrate. And then the last thing, verses 21 through 24, just I highlighted never again, or sometimes it's not ever again, but that whole idea that God is making it really clear that our enemies are going to be ultimately and completely defeated. So who has the wrap up?
I do.
Thank you, Susan.
Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, flute players and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No workman of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's great men. By your magic spell, all the nations were led away. In her was found the blood of prophets and of the saints and of all who have been killed on the earth.
Yeah. Verse 24, who is Babylon? Well, Babylon is every force that the devil uses to persecute God's church, right? That I think verse 24 is a good definer of Babylon, and the ultimate victory is certain. So